So just a little recap or a reminder for us as to this distinction between the mind and the intellect. So you've probably got your own thoughts or understanding of what we mean by mind and intellect. So for the purposes of our discussion, we're going to use the word mind and intellect to mean something specific. So the mind is that aspect of the personal which is non-rational, compared to rational, which is the intellect. So when we use the word non-rational, it's not a pejorative term, it's not a criticism, it's simply a statement. You like something or you don't like something. You can't really reason it out. I like bread, I don't like rice. I mean, why? What's your reason? That's not rational. Well, of course it's not rational. The mind is not rational. The mind is also indiscriminate. So what that means is that it flows on its own towards different objects. And we've all experienced this. Our mind will flow towards objects that we don't even like thinking about. We think about harms that have been done to us in the past. We think about worries that might come into the future. No one likes that. And yet the mind goes there. Why? This is the indiscriminate nature of the mind. Whereas the intellect is conscious thought force. What we might call discriminate. Essentially what that means is that we know what we're thinking about. We know why we're thinking about it. We've got a reason for entertaining that thought. If we don't have a reason for entertaining it, then it's indiscriminate. It's the mind. And in fact, this distinction will, in the later sessions, become an important way for us to help to manage the mind. The mind is always involved where the intellect remains objective. So very briefly, involved simply means that we can't see anything beyond it. If we're involved in our experiences, it means that there's nothing available to us to give us that stepping back and that perspective. Take a simple example of a person who's completely caught up in road rage. They get T-boned by another vehicle, no one's really hurt, but the person is furious. They're so involved in their anger that they're out of control. They can't see it from a broader perspective. If they could, then they'd still be angry, but they'd be able to control it. They'd be objective. Two analogies that we often use here is that the mind and intellect are like a child and an adult. The child has no capacity for self-governance, for filtering, for understanding where it is, what it's doing, speaking of obviously a very young child, whereas an adult does. And in fact, if you see a child doing something which is inappropriate, you don't blame the child, you blame the adult. Children are perfect in their immaturity. It's the job of the adult, the parent, to govern that child effectively. So too, the mind is simply the mind. You can't blame the mind for being the mind, for being irrational, for being involved. But what we should be doing is maintaining governance of it with an adult intellect. The other aspect or the other analogy we sometimes use is the distinction between the river water and the river banks. So the river water flows down the banks. Now, if those banks are deep and strong, then you can direct that water wherever you want and actually use it to generate electricity and for the benefit of the community. If the banks are shallow and weak, then when you get that flood of water, it inundates the fields, it destroys homes, it destroys communities. So too, the mind is full of a flood of emotions. The intellect is like the banks of that river. We cut a channel with our thinking, with our analysis, with our conscious thought force and our ideals to direct that flow of energy. And once we can direct it properly, then we can use it for our benefit. So this is a brief distinction of the mind and intellect.